Now on BBC Two, it's Newsnight with Kirsty Walk.
Tonight, did Sir Ian Blair try to cover up damning evidence about the shooting of an innocent Brazilian? Britain's most senior police officer comes under pressure to resign over the killing of Jean-Charles de Menezes.
All the statements from the lowest to the highest have been made on a basis of false assertions.
An emotional day in Gaza. Could these scenes really be repeated on the West Bank? The Israeli Foreign Minister tells us this is just the beginning. Is the government's refusal to scrap A-levels about educational principles or naked politics? We speak to the Education Minister, Lord Adonis, and a former Education Secretary.
This is below the average for a number of UK burglaries, but above the average for theft of motor vehicles.
And location, location, location at the click of a mouse. But could it reinforce our social divisions? Good evening. The Metropolitan Commissioner, Sir Ian Blair, tried to postpone the independent investigation into the killing of Jean-Charles de Menezes. That revelation today adds to the criticism that since the shooting, the force has not acted quickly enough to establish the truth of what happened. In response, Jean-Charles's relatives said, "We are unable to have confidence in any of the investigative processes." The Independent Police Complaints Commission, in charge of unravelling this fatal mess, will meet the family's solicitor tomorrow. But the family now wants a public inquiry. Here's Robin Denslow.
Are at Stockwell, and police now confirming that they have indeed shot a man dead on the Northern Line at Stockwell after 10 o'clock this morning.
One fact is tragically beyond dispute, that on the morning of July the 22nd, a 27-year-old Brazilian, Jean-Charles de Menezes, was shot dead by two plainclothes police on a tube train in Stockwell, London. Since then, there's been controversy and confusion, not helped, it would seem, by some of the public statements by the Metropolitan Police and their Commissioner, Sir Ian Blair. These now seem to be contradicted by leaked witness statements to the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Just hours after the shooting, the Commissioner said,
"The information I have available is that this shooting is directly linked to the ongoing and expanding anti-terrorist operation. I need to make clear that any death is deeply regrettable. But as I understand the situation, the man was challenged and refused to obey police instructions."
But so far, at least, there is no evidence that the young Brazilian refused to obey police. The witness statements say that Mr Menezes left his flat in Tulse Hill shortly after 9:30. The surveillance officer outside saw him leave, thought he could be one of the bombing suspects, but failed to video him as he was relieving himself. Another officer followed the suspect to a bus stop, but also made no positive identification. Yet the day after the shooting, a police statement said,
"The man who was shot was under police observation because he had emerged from a house that was itself under observation because it was linked to the investigation of yesterday's incidents. He was then followed by surveillance officers to the station. His clothing and his behaviour at the station added to their suspicions."
The suspicions, if not a positive identification, were relayed to Gold Command, the operations centre at Scotland Yard. According to the witness statements, Menezes continued to walk calmly and slowly to the station and even picked up a paper on the way. Officers from the firearms branch, SO19, followed him to the platform. Unchallenged, he boarded a train. It seems the officers had already been authorised to shoot under the rules known as Operation Kratos, a policy developed to deal with suicide bombers. 6 days after the shooting, Sir Ian Blair had this to say.
That it's worth reflecting. Whatever else those officers were doing, they were clearly convinced they were faced with a suicide bomber, and they were running towards him. They were running towards what might have been certain death.
It now emerges that Menezes had already sat down when shot, and that a surveillance officer had grabbed him and pinned his arms to his side, as marksmen fired 7 times into his head and once to his body. Today, Sir Ian Blair faced charges that he misled the public. There could be consequences.
He was completely wrong, and he should have been keeping his powder dry. He should never have been making press statements at that stage until he had in front of him a dossier with witness statements, knowing exactly what had happened. He clearly didn't know precisely what had happened.
We don't know enough to know his position. We know that he has made a number of public statements prematurely, and we suspect on an entirely wrong basis. The buck has to stop with someone. If the buck has to stop with him, then that is for the future. The buck may stop with more than him. We don't know.
On the morning of July the 22nd, just hours after Mr Menezes was shot, Sir Ian Blair wrote to a senior civil servant at the Home Office to clarify the role of the Independent Police Complaints Commission in any inquiry. The Commissioner argued the terror investigation took precedent over an independent inquiry. It was later agreed the IPCC would investigate, but not for some days.
Well, the statutory duty is for the police to call the IPCC in within 24 hours. The police didn't do that. Equally, it appears the IPCC did nothing to intrude themselves on the process until some 6 days later they received a formal request from the police to enter the investigation.
Now it's being suggested that Sir Ian could just possibly face the same fate as the Sussex Police Chief Paul Whitehouse, who was forced to stand down in 2001 over his response to a bungled drugs raid during which a naked unarmed man was shot dead.
Paul Whitehouse made statements in relation to a shooting in Hastings, which were later deemed to be misleading. Now, he may have been in the same situation. He may have said what he was told and what he believed to be correct. But it didn't take long before the Home Secretary, Mr David Blunkett, to virtually force him out of his job.
And the same could happen with Blair, even at a time like this?
Well, I think it could do. I think that if the police authority for London have a vote of no confidence, then he's in a very, very awkward situation.
What happens, of course, depends on the findings of the Independent Police Complaints Commission and whatever legal advice is offered by the Crown Prosecution Service as to whether there is sufficient evidence for any charges to be made. There could presumably be new evidence to come out that hasn't yet been leaked. But I asked one of the de Menezes family lawyers for her judgment.
At the end of the day, if the facts support that, there ought to be a prosecution. Of whom or of how many, we simply don't know.
Metropolitan Police are already involved in another case over the use of firearms. In 1999, Harry Stanley was shot dead by officers who thought that the table leg he was carrying was a shotgun. 2 officers were arrested earlier this year on suspicion of murder and gross negligence manslaughter.
In my view, in such an incident where there's an operation and the involvement of officers in a command chain, if they gave certain instructions during the course of that operation that were negligent to such a level that you could call them grossly negligent, and they connect directly with a decision to open fire, then we have a possibility of a charge of gross negligence manslaughter.
They've got looming storm clouds coming.
So if there were a prosecution, firearms officers might simply refuse to do the job anymore?
Yes, they could. And they could do it without any fear of discipline because they're volunteers. They can just say, we no longer want to be volunteers.
But that would be a disaster for the police at a time like this.
Yes, it would.
Tonight, representatives of the young Brazilian shot dead by police on a London tube called for a public inquiry and demanded that Sir Ian Blair should resign.
Robin Denzil, I'm joined here in the studio by Asad Rehman, a spokesman for the Justice for Regime campaign. From Dusseldorf by Paul Whitehouse, the former Chief Constable of Sussex Police, who retired after the shooting by his officers of an innocent man. And from Leeds by the London MP, the London Labour MP, Frank Dobson. Asad Rehman, first of all, what is the family's reaction to the news that Sir Ian Blair called for a delay in starting the independent inquiry?
Well, they're very angry. We clearly are shocked that it took 6 days before the investigation began. We're shocked that evidence that may have been lost, evidence may have even been tainted. This is such a crucial issue, not only for the family, but I think for all the people of London. The introduction of a shoot-to-kill policy, it seems grossly negligent that with such public attention on such a case, that we allowed an investigation to only take place a week later, and to take place in the condition where so much either misstatements or lies were in the public domain.
What do you think is the Commissioner's position now?
I think it's largely untenable. I think he has to bear the responsibility for the actions of his officers, for the policy, and he is at the top of the chain of command. I think he has to go, and I think the Home Secretary must make that move now.
Paul Whitehouse, you retired after an innocent man was killed by a police officer. Would you surely now recommend to Sir Ian Blair that perhaps he should take the honourable path?
No, because I did exactly the right thing in 1998, as Sir Ian Blair did on this occasion, which was to say to the press, in response to the questions that they asked, because they wanted to know what had happened, that on the information available to me, that I believe that my officers had acted properly. I still believe that. There were unsuccessful prosecutions. Sir Ian Blair said exactly what I said. In other words, on the information available to him, he said what he believed to be true at the time. And this is exactly analogous to the officers who have that fateful decision to decide whether to shoot or not on our behalf. They have a very short time to make the decision, and they have very little time to make that decision. Sometimes they get it wrong.
Yes, but you heard the criticism in the film from the former commander of the Metropolitan Police saying, actually, that Sir Ian Blair should not have been making press statements at that early time until he was in full command of all the facts.
Well, the difficulty is that if there's going to be an investigation so that all the facts are available, at that stage it will not be possible for the chief police officer of the force concerned, whether in London or elsewhere, to say anything, because the matter will be in the hands of the investigators and the prosecutors. It may well be sub judice, and it would be improper to say anything, because just as it is important for the family and for the police officers involved, there should be an objective view of this.
Frank Dobson, you're a London MP, you're listening to this now, and obviously you have a close personal interest in the area. What should Londoners think now?
Well, I think they're very perturbed about what happened, and the most recent information makes it clear that a wholly innocent man behaving apparently wholly innocently and not in any way suspiciously was shot dead for no good reason. But I think Londoners also will know that everybody was in a terrible, tense situation. But I think there is a broader issue here. The police have allowed the false impression, the misleading impression that this man was behaving suspiciously, that he was wearing a heavy coat, that he vaulted over the barriers at the station, that he ran down the escalator and onto the train in a suspicious way. That has been allowed to be the current story for about 3 weeks now. We now know that that was not true. And I think that's very disturbing, because at a time when we're dependent on the security services and the police and the information they provide in counter-terrorism, when the public and members of Parliament are going to have to make difficult decisions about what to do about our civil liberties, then it's very disturbing that this information, the true information, was not made available as soon as it was known to senior police officers.
Well, there's two. I want to ask two questions there. First, Paul Whitehouse, that's exactly right, isn't it? Because Sir Ian Blair came out very early on with this supposedly damning information about Jean-Charles' behaviour, but there was no rush to come out and say, well, actually, we don't now think that's right.
You're absolutely right that he didn't say that, but I wouldn't expect after the initial announcement, just as I said nothing, I didn't correct the continually misleading stories about in Hastings, and he hasn't been able to correct it either, because the matter is now in the hands of the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and its chairman said that everyone should shut up.
Well, Ray, let's just talk about it from the family's point of view. Finding out the truth in this way, what was the impact of that on them?
I mean, that's very devastating to see the picture of Jean lying in a pool of blood on the floor of a tube, then pictures to be broadcast around the world. That's the pictures that his family have seen. Obviously, they're very, very distressed about that. But we must also deal with the fact that Sir Ian Blair did not call in the investigation immediately. He had 6 days. So within those 6 days, he could have corrected the...
Yes, but what about the IPCC investigation now?
Well, I think the IPPC investigation has to be concluded speedily. I think we definitely need it. I do think there is an issue now that it has been. I don't think it necessarily resolves all the wider issues. The community, the family, I think the campaign and the people of London now definitely need a public inquiry if we're going to have full public confidence in our police force.
Paul Whitehouse, some officers may now face prosecution. Isn't this possibly a necessary step in restoring faith in the police?
Of course it's necessary. If the investigation shows that people have done wrong at whatever level in the organisation, then they should be prosecuted or disciplined as the evidence shows, and that is absolutely necessary for the good of the police service and for the good of the public and for the family. I can't disagree with that for a moment, but what's important is that we should not rehearse these matters before the investigation is concluded properly, and I think it's a great pity that the matter has been leaked.
Well, let's just put the questions about the prosecution to Frank Dobson a different way. If prosecutions do eventually go ahead, as we heard there, of course, it's entirely voluntary for police officers to carry firearms. It is likely that fewer and fewer police officers will be prepared to take that risk. What will happen then? Will we have to see the army in these times of stress and worries about terrorism on the streets with guns?
Well, I would sincerely hope not, and I would hope that it would be possible to conduct these operations in a way that is sound and relatively safe. It will never be wholly safe, but it clearly was very badly conducted on this occasion. But I come back to the point that the public and everyone has been misled by the police not correcting the story that first came out. I can't imagine, for instance, that the Prime Minister would have made the comments he did on this awful incident had he known the facts.
Frank Dobson, very briefly, because I have to cut you off here. Do you think Sir Ian Blair's position is now untenable?
Well, his position is very difficult, but in my experience over a long period of time, I've always thought that he was a person of integrity, and I'm sure that he made the early statements not in full knowledge of what was going on. But I do think that he must take some responsibility, as must others, for not disclosing the real facts a lot earlier than they did. Because, as I said before, we're going to have to depend on their word. They're saying we need to question people for 3 months instead of 14 days.
Thank you very much.
We want to do all sorts of things.
I'm afraid I'm going to cut you off short. Thank you very much indeed. An Israeli settler shot dead 3 Palestinians on the West Bank today, and another set fire to herself as Israeli troops started to enforce the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. Jewish settlers, including children, were dragged from their homes 24 hours after the deadline for evacuation of the region passed. So far, only a handful of the 21 Jewish settlements have been completely evacuated. Much of today's resistance to the pullout is centred in the largest of the Jewish settlements, Neve Dekalim, from where James Reynolds joins us. James, first of all the scenes of the struggles of the settlers against the Israeli officers, what kind of impact are they having on Israeli public opinion?
I think for some people it's fairly traumatic. Let's put this into context. Israel is a country which was founded on the idea of the absorption and unity of the Jewish people. So for people to see scenes of forcible eviction and internal conflict in this society, I think is pretty traumatic. But having said all that, among ordinary secular Israelis, there's no great love of the Gaza Strip. A lot of people believe it's brought them nothing but problems. They simply want to see the back of it. Therefore, they are with Ariel Sharon.
So what do you think now will be the timetable? Will the Israeli forces be able to get this evacuation completed within the allotted time?
I think even more so. I was at an army briefing just a few weeks ago, and army commanders were talking about 6 weeks for the completion of the disengagement plan. They're now talking of 6 days. That is a dramatic change. They are able to get rid of these settlements, it seems, very, very quickly. That throws up all sorts of questions. One in particular, if the international community sees Ariel Sharon doing this in less than a week, perhaps it may put pressure on him to start further withdrawals in the West Bank.
James, thank you very much. Well, there's no doubt that the pullout from Gaza is a major event in the history of Israel, but will it pave the way for even more historic developments on the West Bank? Here's David Sells.
For Israel itself, a day of reckoning. The national flag was burned by dissident Jewish settlers. Others were dragged sobbing and screaming from homes and synagogues. Families who have lived in Gaza for many years were forced to quit. Many left quietly, resigned to their fate. Settlers wept, soldiers were tearful. For long years, Israeli governments allowed their citizens to colonize this occupied territory. So today, indeed, was a moment of truth, not least for its architect.
The pictures that we are seeing are heartbreaking. They are tearing my soul. I am responsible for this. Attack me, accuse me. Don't attack the men and women in uniform.
Gaza itself has always been an anomaly. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding father, when told it had been seized from Egypt in the 1967 Six-Day War, said, "Give it back." A prominent Israeli general hoped it would just float out to sea. And Egypt itself was always unhappy with Gaza's Palestinians. But many Zionists still see it as part of the biblical land, the land of Israel.
Gaza has never been the heartland of Jewish presence in the region, unlike the West Bank, areas of the West Bank that are sacred to many Jews, most Jews. But Gaza does not fall in that category. Gaza was the most expendable of the occupied territories. So if one wants to take a cynical view of what the Israelis have done, they're getting rid of what's expendable in order to hold on to what they've deemed to be strategically vital.
As for the Palestinians today, they were rejoicing, not least the Islamic militants of Hamas, those past promoters of suicide bombing against Israeli civilians who see the Gaza retreat as a victory.
I think there's two main reactions in Palestinian society. One, and this is mainly from militant factions, that this is seen as a withdrawal due to resistance. And then there's another part of Palestinian society that's taking a more skeptical line on it and seeing it really as a withdrawing from Gaza to consolidate Israel's hold on the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Gaza, in truth, is a sideshow to a wider picture, to a more complex problem. Israeli dominance of the West Bank, where there are many times more settlers and settlements, is a major issue for any future peace process. As part of this Gaza disengagement, Israel has pledged too to pull out of 4 isolated settlements in the north, Kadim, Ganim, Sanur and Homesh. But Mr. Sharon is determined to retain several major settlements in the West Bank. Among them, Ma'ale Adumim to the east of Arab East Jerusalem, Efrat and Gush Etzion between Jerusalem and Hebron, and Ariel in the northern West Bank. Prime Minister Sharon was the godfather of Israel's settlement policy, yet where Gaza is concerned, he has backtracked. One reason is demography, the need to avoid absorbing a swiftly growing Palestinian population. Politically, though, what could be his thinking?
By taking the initiative, he can forge the long-term territorial and political status of Israel rather than have others do it for him. In other words, by getting rid of Gaza and perhaps tomorrow getting rid of greater portions of the West Bank, he could unilaterally decide what the long-term status of Israel will be, a state that controls obviously what is now Israel proper, but also Jerusalem and those areas of the West Bank that he, Ariel Sharon, deems vital to Israel's long-term strategic interests.
Palestinians are right to be worried, and my concern is there is so much jubilation at the fact that Israel is withdrawing from Gaza that people are really not looking at the bigger picture, that it's not as rosy as people are making out.
And Sharon himself faces a tough internal political reality.
There are critical primaries in the Likud party, Ariel Sharon's party, and he's being challenged by Benjamin Netanyahu from the right. And so for him to consolidate his base, he needs to show that he's not about to make similar concessions or similar gestures in the West Bank as he just did in Gaza.
Occupation of the biblical land of Israel would unavoidably dilute its Jewishness. David Ben-Gurion put it this way: we either have a Jewish state without the land of Israel, or we have the land of Israel without a Jewish state.
David Sells. Well, earlier I spoke to the Israeli Foreign Minister Silvan Shalom, and I asked him what this move means for the future of the peace process.
I think that we are taking an historic move these days. The disengagement gives us an opportunity to move toward peace. It gives us hope to the people of Israel and to the Palestinians. And I would like to believe that not only the Israelis but the Palestinians as well will seize this opportunity in order to create a better future for all of us here in the region.
And I want to talk to you about the creation of that future in a moment, but first, can I confirm that this move is irreversible?
I think it's irreversible. The question is what would happen in the day after. We would like to hand over the territories to the control of the Palestinian Authority, and that they will make sure that there will be no rockets and missiles that they will fire from Gaza toward Israel. If we will have peace and quiet, there will be no reason for us to reoccupy Gaza. But of course, if they will use our withdrawal to approach their launchers and to attack all the Israeli cities near the border, it might be different. We hope that we will have the positive scenario and not the negative one.
You talk about the fact that the Palestinian Authority needs to deliver, but don't the Israelis have a responsibility too to improve economic and social conditions, for example by relinquishing control of air and sea links? Surely the people of Gaza will need to see improvement pretty quickly, or there'll be a void that Hamas can move into.
No, I don't think that they should use those excuses. There is no need for that. We are going to withdraw fully from Gaza. We are not going to stay there. There will be no settlers, no Israeli soldiers, and we are going to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor. It's the buffer zone between the Egyptian side of the border and the Palestinian side. They will have a free access from Gaza into Egypt and from Gaza to the West Bank through the State of Israel. Of course, about the seaport, it will take time. The seaport is very risky for us, but even though we are willing to do it, you should know that they can bring ships from Iran that will be fully loaded with all kinds of weapons and with maybe some terrorists that will infiltrate. But even though we believe that it needs to be done, it will take time. Until then, we will do everything we can to help them. We are in a very good contact with the donor countries, with the other countries that are involved, and we are asking all of them to give the aid to the Palestinians.
You can see the anguish of people being removed from Gaza today. Can you imagine repeating these scenes right across the West Bank? I mean, in other words, is this the beginning of the removal, or is this the end of the removal from settlements?
You know, always there are so many conspiracy theories that are coming from the Arab world or from the Palestinian side, that we are doing it from Gaza in order to continue with our control in the West Bank. I want you to know that we are really serious to move toward peace, and we want immediately after the withdrawal from Gaza to move to full implementation of the roadmap, and we can do it. The question is what will be in the day after. I think Gaza is a model. It can be a positive one and it can be a very negative one. If after the withdrawal from Gaza, the disengagement, that will bring peace and quiet, it will bring, I think, an opportunity for us to move together toward peace. But if it will be totally different, and they will use this new opportunity that they will have to attack us, I don't see any Israeli prime minister in the future that will take the same risk initiative.
Silvan Shalom, thank you. Tomorrow is a day of reckoning for hundreds of thousands of A-level students. But what they already know is that the government has decreed that these hard-earned exams don't offer academic institutions or employers enough information about their capabilities. So next year there'll be a series of tougher questions in each subject, and the pupils will be awarded marks for each module within a subject, and that will be published. So it could all have been so very different had the government accepted the findings of its own report and scrapped A-levels altogether. So why didn't it? Here's our political correspondent, David Grossman.
There are some things you can normally count on during a traditional British summer. In July, we complain about rain and, simultaneously, the water companies.
We would like to remind you that there is a hosepipe and sprinkler ban in force in this area.
By August, attention normally turns to BA doing FA and pupils getting all A's. Lord Adonis may have the name of a superhero, but he is in fact the new schools minister. And in August, that means doing battle with those who say exams have got easier.
Instead, let's celebrate success with our young people and their parents and their teachers and do our utmost to stimulate more achievement by more pupils.
But actually, the row about this year's record proportion of A-level passes and grade A's is different from previous years because in February, say the government's critics, they passed up the opportunity for wholesale reform of the system.
I want a government that gives a clear commitment to rigour throughout the education system, that says that A-levels are going to stay, that's going to sort out vocational qualifications and make it available from the age of 14. If we had a government that made those sorts of steps, there wouldn't be this sterile debate every year, and instead we could concentrate on doing what we ought to be doing, which is congratulating young people on working hard for the qualifications they're going to get tomorrow.
So how did we get to this point? A bit of revision needed, perhaps. In 2000, the government changed the way A-levels worked, introducing what was called Curriculum 2000. However, when the first batch of results came in 2 years later, there were thousands upon thousands of accusations from pupils and schools of grade rigging and organisational chaos. In response, the government appointed the former Chief Inspector of Schools, Mike Tomlinson, to conduct a wholesale review of the system. In October last year, he reported and recommended replacing GCSE's A-levels and vocational qualifications with a single multi-level diploma, but the government said no. Instead, ministers said they'd toughen the current exams and introduce new specialised vocational diplomas. To help combat grade inflation, the Tomlinson report also recommended advanced extension awards, new grades of A-star and A-star-star for exceptional performers. Again, the government said no, instead promising optional extra questions to stretch the brightest students. Ken Spores helped write the Tomlinson report. So why does he think that ministers rejected large chunks of a document that it commissioned in the first place?
What changed was we entered the choppy waters of an election period and, in fact, a Prime Minister who ultimately didn't agree with his ministers. Those ministers went very near to the election, and after that we were definitely in trouble.
Ken Spores says it was the schools minister, David Miliband, who was driving reform. For a while, it appeared the government was fully signed up.
David had actually set it up. He had provided us with the 4 criteria that we had to meet. That was absolutely clear, and there were repeated meetings between the members of the Tomlinson Working Group and ministers during that period, and we were encouraged all the way. I mean, they did say at certain points we have reservations about this or that, some on assessment, but never the reservations about a unified diploma system.
But in the reshuffle that followed David Blunkett's resignation last December, it was Ruth Kelly who became the new Education Secretary, not David Miliband. He was moved out of the department altogether. Some believe the first task Ms Kelly was set by Downing Street was to distance the government from the Tomlinson report. Sir Mike Tomlinson himself believes this was a political decision by the Prime Minister.
One of the difficulties would be to be abandoning A-levels where a significant proportion of the public believe those are the gold standards. I think that more and more people are beginning to question that and doubt whether it's any longer sustainable as a statement. But I think that clearly in politics decisions are not always driven by the educational arguments. They will on occasion be driven by other factors.
But now the election's over, and the new team at the DFES includes the Prime Minister's former policy advisor, Andrew, now Lord Adonis. So, will they revisit the Tomlinson report?
I think that the level of political caution or cowardice that they've shown is actually unwarranted. I actually think there are opportunities now to have that debate, and they should have it.
My suspicion is that at some point in time we will have to reform 14 to 19 in its entirety, and therefore I believe that, and a lot of other people believe it as well. And there remains a consensus that was built up prior to the report. It remains pretty solid. So I think there will need to be change, but I do understand sometimes from a political perspective change has to be approached with care, caution, and perhaps with a degree of stealth on occasions.
Tomorrow, students will be opening yet another record batch of A-level results. With luck, if they do well, they'll never have to think about A-levels again. The government could, however, face a resit.
David Grossman. Well, earlier I spoke to the Education Minister, Andrew Adonis. I put it to him that by making the two changes, including harder questions and allowing universities to see the breakdown of results, he's accepting the exam is flawed.
No, that's not the case at all, Kirsty. If you look at the proposals that we've announced today, giving people the individual module marks for A-levels is simply giving them more information from the current A-level system. So far as the harder questions are concerned, we already have an exam called the Advanced Extension Award, which is an addition to A-level. We used to have, in the old days, the S-level, which was a separate paper too. What we've said is that to mainstream these papers, we're going to make these questions available within the A-level papers themselves, which will make them easier to take, easier to mark, and much more accessible for universities. So the changes that I referred to today are developments on the current A-level system to make it better. They're not a fundamental change in the system or a replacement of it.
To make it better because you feel it needs to be improved. I mean, you're going to constantly be in this bind of making changes because you ignored the central tenet in Mike Tomlinson's report, i.e. scrap A-levels in favour of diploma. And that decision by Mike Tomlinson was supported by all manner of education experts.
Well, many of the proposals of the Tomlinson report we are implementing, including the tougher questions at the top. One of the main reasons that Sir Mike Tomlinson proposed his diploma in his own report was so that there would be greater stretch at the top. He also wanted to see more vocational options available in schools, and he wanted to see, in response to employers, much greater emphasis on literacy and numeracy in schools. The approach that we've taken is to accept much of his diagnosis, which was absolutely right on those issues, and we're acting on them all, but we had a difference of opinion as to whether this actually involved scrapping A-levels entirely to meet them. And our view was that the current A-level system could be adapted to meet challenge at the top. We're introducing new specialised vocational diplomas, which will be introduced and mainstreamed within schools, and we're making changes to make literacy and numeracy more central to what schools do. It was a political judgment we had to make on the degree of change in the system necessary to achieve his objectives.
You've said it yourself, you had to make a political decision. Now, a member of the Tomlinson committee told us today it was political cowardice ahead of an election. And Mike Tomlinson said, clearly in politics, decisions are not always driven by the educational arguments.
No, I think I've made very clear to you, Kirsty, this was driven wholly by the educational arguments. It was our judgment that we had to make on the degree of change that was necessary to achieve the objectives which Sir Mike Tomlinson had set out. And as I've said to you, his objectives, which were a greater challenge at the top, much stronger emphasis on availability of vocational qualifications in schools, and a better concentration on literacy and numeracy in secondary schools. Those objectives we entirely shared.
Isn't it true that Tony Blair vetoed the central part of this report, i.e. scrapping A-levels, because he was terrified that middle-class parents would desert Labour at the last election?
No, that isn't true at all. This was a judgment which was led by Ruth Kelly as Education Secretary. But of course it's a judgment which the government is entirely entitled to make. It is the government's job to make decisions of this kind. The question which we have to ask ourselves as guardians of the integrity of the exam system is what will provide the quality and the opportunities which our young people need. Our view was that a wholesale abolition of the A-level system was not what the country needed at this time. And our judgment on what's happened in this year's A-level results is to believe that we made a correct decision at that time.
Well, I'm joined now by Estelle Morris, the former Education Secretary in 2001 to 2002. Estelle Morris, we face next year with the idea that there'll be extra difficult questions for some A-level students who will then automatically know that they're not going to do the best of all the exams. Wouldn't it be much simpler to take a diploma, as Mike Tomlinson suggests, rather than tinkering with A-levels?
I think it would have done, really. I think the Tomlinson report is possibly the third government report over the last 20 years into the future of A-levels. And the problem is, if you look at the government's response to Tomlinson, there's a key phrase, and it actually says, we've made it a priority to preserve A-levels. Well, if you look at 14 to 19 education and ask for radical change to meet the needs of the economy and the new pressures placed on children and society, if you do that, but at the same time you say the two things you can't change are A-levels and GCSE, what you're left with is twiddling at the edges. And I think what we heard from Andrew just then was exactly that. And until the government's, I think, courageous enough to actually say to somebody, look at the needs of our children and the economy for 14 to 19, and at the same time we give you permission to look at whether A-levels and GCSEs are the right pillars of assessment, I think we'll just end up discussing this year after year. It's incredibly debilitating for those students who are waiting for their results.
Yeah. Do you think that the political judgment was really right, that middle-class parents would be horrified because of some totem of A-levels, that they actually would be so concerned if the actual exam was changed?
No, and what's really surprising, the government and the education ministers don't run away from tough decisions. I mean, for heaven's sake, if we'd have waited till parents were behind top-up fees or differential fees, we wouldn't have passed them by now. Something else interesting is happening. A lot of the leading schools now, state I think will happen in the future, are going to the International Baccalaureate. Universities are already introducing their own tests. So all the evidence is that there are things about the present A-levels that are not fit for purpose. I think the key thing, though, is that what the government's got to say is the rigour, the in-depth study that is there historically in A-levels can remain, but it needn't remain just as A-levels. It can be so much broader than that.
And that's the education part. But let's talk about the political part very briefly at the end. It was a political decision, wasn't it? It wasn't an education decision.
I wasn't there, but as both an educationalist and a politician, the educationalist me can't understand the decision, the politician can.
Esther Morris, thank you.
you.
Coming up on the programme, why the Internet Guide to Suburbia is upsetting anti-poverty campaigners. But first, a roundup of today's news. Our main story tonight, the family of the man shot dead on the London tube train have called for the resignation of the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Ian Blair. On this programme, the former Cabinet Minister and London MP Frank Dobson said the Commissioner must accept some responsibility for the anger over how the shooting had been handled. A court in Rome has agreed to the extradition of Hamdi Isaac, also known as Hussein Osman, wanted in connection with the failed July 21st bomb plot. Isaac was arrested in Italy a week after the failed attacks. He's expected back in Britain by the end of September. His lawyer, Antoinetta Sonessa, plans to appeal against the decision. The Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, voted against the recent cut in interest rates, but was overruled by fellow members of the Monetary Policy Committee in a close 5-4 vote. Mutiny in the ranks, our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders, is here to explain. Stephanie, first of all, strange goings-on, overruled?
Well, I mean, you can get too carried away with the criminology of, who voted how. It is the first time that Mervyn King's been on the losing side, but it was only actually the result of one member, Richard Lambert, the former editor of the FT, changing his vote. I mean, they've had quite a lot of close votes before. You might say it was surprising that this hasn't happened before. I think what is significant about this is this rate cut 2 weeks ago, the decision was a much closer thing than people realised at the time. We all sort of said at the time, they had to come running to the rescue of the retail sales figures and the housing market. It turns out, looking at these minutes, that they were looking at those things, but also they were concerned about signs of higher inflation. And in fact, you had that higher inflation figure yesterday. Yeah. So certainly, reasonable people on the committee could differ, given that the bank targets inflation, not retail sales, about whether they should cut rates, and Mervyn King turns out to be one of them.
Yeah, but reasonable people can differ, but then you've got worries about a slowdown, equal worries about higher inflation, as you said. We had that already. What if both are right and we're talking about this stagflation?
Well, we're not talking about stagflation, but we may be talking about slower growth than we've got used to the last few years. I have the obligatory graphic. If you look at inflation over the last few years, this is the reason why the bank's been able to keep interest rates as low as they have been able to, because, inflation's been so well behaved. And people looked at that and they said, wow, we've grown so much, we're not pushing up prices and wages anymore by growing. It's magic. We must be becoming more efficient as an economy. Now, we may have got a bit more efficient, but it turns out that's not the whole story, because service prices have been merrily rising along. Prices of things like haircuts have been rising all this time. The price of the average haircut has gone up 60%, you'll be interested to know, in the last 10 years.
Glad you researched that today.
But it didn't hurt inflation because goods prices were falling. You know, that's all these cheap jeans and toys coming in from China, and that was keeping inflation down. Now you see now goods prices are also rising,
and haircuts are rising as well.
And haircuts are also rising, and so jeans are going up as well. That's pushing up inflation. Now it's partly about the oil price, but that we hope is temporary. It could also be that this China effect or the cheap Asia effect is beginning to peter out. I mean, there's only so many times you can switch to buying cheap Chinese jeans. You know, there's a limit to how low the price of a pair of jeans can go. And if that is petering out and we have more problems with inflation, I think that does suggest not a disaster, but we have less room to grow than we might have hoped, and the bank's going to be more worried about inflation in the future. Interest rates may be higher than we hoped.
Steffi, thank you. At least 43 people have died and 76 more injured in a series of bombings in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. The first two bombs targeted a busy bus station, the third a nearby hospital, as victims of the earlier blasts were being taken in. The attacks are the largest by insurgents in recent weeks and come at a time when progress on the Iraqi constitution is deadlocked. At the markets, the FTSE 100 share index closed down 30 points, while in New York, the Dow Jones closed up 37. Against the euro, the pound closed up. Against the dollar, the pound remained unchanged. How many muggings took place in your postcode this year? And what did next door's house sell for? And do marketeers really think you're living in a sprawling subtopia or white van culture? The answer is only a click away on the internet sites that bring together public information about your neighbourhood. Now, an influential think tank thinks it could all lead to social segregation. Paul Mason reports.
Little boxes on the hillside, little boxes
Sutton, Surrey. You probably had an image of the place in mind before you saw the pictures.
There's a green one and a pink one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made.
Now, the way we stereotype neighbourhoods is changing. Forget folklore and think hard fact. Our cities are being shaped by software. At the website upmystreet.com, you can type in your postcode and find out everything from crime statistics, school performance and the selling price of the house next door. It's one of a growing number of neighbourhood information sites, and they are changing the way we see our streets.
This information has been available for a while. What we're doing is bringing it together in one place. And consumers demand it, they want it. Consumers want more and more information. They want to be empowered to take the right decision with full and proper information. We're giving it to them in a way that's user-friendly, in a way that's accurate, you know, so that they can use it, you know, to take decisions.
So what can it tell us about Sutton, Surrey?
It's below the average for a number of UK burglaries, but above the average for theft of motor vehicles. So
there's a few scallies in that area, really.
I wouldn't
That's
like
the problem, isn't it?
I wouldn't like to comment.
You see that and you say, right, there's a few scallies in that area. It's exactly this that is worrying urban sociologists. The government is trying to encourage socially mixed communities, but the websites are helping us do some social engineering of our own.
And there's doctors and lawyers and business executives, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same.
In the last 10 or 15 years, there's very good evidence now to suggest that very small areas, streets, postcode areas and so on, are becoming more and more similar within themselves and more differentiated between themselves. So this is a demographic trend that has been going on for quite a long while now. And I suppose what we're suggesting is that this informatization of space, of place, supports that trend. There's a kind of implicit encouragement for people to use data strategically to make strategic decisions about where to locate.
As well as official stats, neighbourhood sites use data from marketing companies. They use categories like affluent grey, industrial grit, white van culture or welfare borderline.
You put your postcode in, we'll be able to tell you whether there's rich people living there, poor people, families with 2 or 3 children, single people, high net worth individuals. Again, it allows you to look at the types of people who live in that area and whether it's the sort of place you want to live, or whether it's got a diverse mix, or whether it's all weighted in one area.
It's all been done before, of course. In 1898, philanthropist Charles Booth published a map colour-coding London street by street according to Victorian class stereotypes.
Lower class, vicious, semi-criminal.
Very poor, casual, chronic want.
Upper middle and upper classes. Wealthy.
When Charles Booth drew this map, most people didn't have a choice about where they lived. We do, and neighbourhood information sites are beginning to have an impact on that choice, because it's a small step from researching the profile of an area to drawing up your own checklist of who you'd like to live near and who you wouldn't. And in America, that's already happening.
You can't just gain data about particular zip codes that you might enter. You can do that as well, but you're also confronted by a screen which asks you to be explicit about a set of preferences, both cultural, demographic, leisure-orientated, environmental and so on. And then the internet site will actually sort out the states, the cities, the towns, even the zip codes that fulfill those criteria. You could even enter the zip code within which you currently reside, and it will tell you the zip code in another state that most closely corresponds to that one.
Online communities of like-minded people are a big feature of the web. So are sites that let consumers make informed choices. When all this comes together to reshape our cities, you might notice something different about the people in your street.
They all look just the same.
Ah, but where does Paul Mason live? And if all that appeals to your baser instincts or appalls you, find out more on our website at bbc.co.uk/Newsnight. Tomorrow's front pages, and beginning with an exclusive in the Miller, that the Gold Commander of the Metropolitan Police, Cressida Dix, announced to her officers minutes before Jean-Charles de Menendez was shot, "Don't kill him, take him alive and detain him." And it also talks about Sir Ian Blair fighting for his job. Moving on to the Daily Mail now. Shoot to kill was there a cover-up? Met Chief faces calls to quit after these damning new allegations. Moving on to the Guardian, again, Met Chief trying to stop shooting inquiry. Pictures of settlers trying to resist removal from the settlements in Gaza. Moving on to the Independent, again, Exodus front page picture from Gaza. The Times, record A-level results fuel race for places at university. On the right-hand side there, left-hand side, England crash, suffering a 4-1 defeat to Denmark. Scotland tonight was 2-2 with Austria. And on the Sun, Stay Jude is the front story about Jude Law and Sienna Miller. That's all from Newsnight tonight, but there's more throughout the night on BBC News 24. Gavin will be back with more tomorrow. Until then, from all of us in the programme, good night.
Now 6 months to change his life from a teacher to a rock star. Naked Us over on BBC One. Here on BBC